Good morning. You guys hear me okay? Yep. Bend it down just a little bit. Let's get this thing turned on. There we go. Perfect. All right. I'm going to talk to you this morning a little bit about a subject that is near and dear to me, and I've been studying for a long time. I've got, to my wife's chagrin, I've got probably hundreds of books about this. And you say, well, how could you have that many? Because there's aspects to this about who we are that causes us to be deceived. You think about a used car salesman talking to you. I mean, we can all think back to the times we got deceived, right? To start off with, I had a friend, I'll leave nameless. He saw a great deal for a motorcycle on the internet, and it was about half price. And he couldn't believe it. He found this wonderful deal. So the only catch was he couldn't pay for it on eBay, but the guy wanted him to pay for with this other thing, right? Not PayPal, which is the standard protected method in eBay. So he did, and didn't get his motorcycle. Found out that motorcycle had been sold like 7 other times. This guy had this little scam going with the motorcycle. He lost $9,800 on the deal. So it does happen. I had a neighbor too that was bragging about this wonderful tractor, and he got such a steal on it, right? Yeah, one day we're coming down the driveway and the police are there and they're loading the tractor up on it's a stolen tractor. That's why he got such a good deal. So deception happens to us all, right? And one of the things that I hope that you take away from this is, as much as I've studied deception, I can be easily deceived outside of Christ. Easily. We do not stand a chance without Christ. We can be easily deceived by others. We can be deceived by the enemy. And if you get nothing out of the lesson, that's the big one, right? So deception. Look at all the different words here. Hoax, fabricated, concocted, counterfeit, falsified, swindle. Don't raise your hand, but I'm just going to ask, have you ever been deceived? Almost everybody in here, right? I bet everybody has at some point in their life. Would you like to know how not to be deceived? Is there actually such a thing? Well, yeah, there is actually. And the Bible tells us this, right? The scripture we just read is very powerful. It says, the wisdom of the prudent is to give thought to their ways, but the folly of fools is deception. So Proverbs is a beautiful book. I mean, we as a family have done this several times. It's beautiful because it's got 31 chapters. How many days in a typical month? It's 30 or 31, right? So there's no months that have more than 31. So you can just decide you're going to read Proverbs every month. So how it works is chapter 1 is Proverbs 1. Chapter 2 is Proverbs 2. Now in February, you got 28 days, so you got a little more reading to do, catch up. But then on those days like May, you got a handy little chapter in there for every day, and you just make that part of your daily ritual. It takes 5 or 10 minutes to do it. The wisdom that comes out of Proverbs is incredible, and this is one of them. So we give thought to their ways, which means, in Romans 12, it talks about be transformed by the renewing of your mind, right? And that's the ticket here, is we have to give thought and we have to let Christ help us with our thinking. That's the way to think about it. And today I'm going to stick pretty much with people and deception. There's 3 parts to this lesson. The next one is about nations and deception, and the final one is end times deception. I will touch a little bit on some scripture and the other 2, but not too much, right? So, all right. I know there's at least one person here who knows this face, so do not answer the question. Anybody know who that is? All right, I'll help you a little bit. Can you read that? John Leonard Orr. Ever heard of him? Okay, let's go on here. He lived in Pasadena, California. He was a firefighter and an investigator. Actually, he was quite a hero. He got into the fire unit and worked himself up from the guy that carried the hose out to all the way to the chief. He wrote manuals on arsonists and how to find arsonists and everything else, right? Pretty much a hero locally out there. He was also an arsonist. In fact, He was responsible for over 2,000 fires, one of them killing 4 people. And he would actually go start them and then go and help solve them. And everybody's kind of like, wow, this guy's really good at this. Well, if you started the fire, you're going to kind of know where to go look, right? And he had this little method where he would take a piece of paper and some matches and a cigarette and a rubber band, and he would light the cigarette and it would burn down to the matches, set the matches on fire, and he would stick it into pillows and stuff like that, and that's how the fire started. And apparently up there north of where he lived in the brushy areas of California, the previous year before he got caught, there were 67 fires that year, and the next year only 1. And it had been like this for a while until they captured him. Now, do you think folks around him were shocked? Yep. Yeah, they were. All right, what about that guy? Anybody? You probably know the name. Bernie Madoff. Have you ever heard that name? Anybody? He lived in New York City. He was an investment advisor. Now, this guy was the investment advisor to the rich. I mean, the rich and famous. If you knew them, they were involved with him. He was giving great returns on their money, and everybody started piling in and handing him money. He had quite a few clients, actually 4,800 clients. But he was also a fraudster and a Ponzi. He was running a big Ponzi scheme. Billions of dollars this guy took. Now he's sitting in jail. So he frauded over 4,800 people. For years, people just flocked to him, and they thought it was a privilege to be able to even have their money with him. And yet, they were deceived. What do you think caused them to put their money with him? Greed. It was pure and simple. They could see those returns. They threw to the winds. It's like, well, normally I would do the analysis here, but my buddy Jeff invested with him, so golly, I trust him, so I'm going to put my money in there too, right? I want part of those things. That happens, right? That happens. All right, let's get started back where it all started, Adam and Eve. All right, I want to read here Genesis chapter 3. I think it's very enlightening. This at least tells us what we're up against. It says, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. Now, we always think of this snake. Now, my mom is deathly afraid of snakes, so there is no way she would talk to a snake, okay? I probably think there's a few people in here that wouldn't talk to a snake. I don't think he appeared as a snake. I think he appeared as something very brilliant and beautiful. Otherwise, he probably wouldn't have had anything to do with it. I don't think she'd sit there and talk to a python, right? I don't know. That's just me. It says, and said unto the woman, Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden? And the woman said unto the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden, God has said, Ye shall not eat of it. What is that tree? Anybody? Tree of life, right? Whoever said that. We're promised that as Christians, aren't we? When we go to heaven, we get full access to that tree. That's pretty exciting. It says, all right, ye did not eat of it, neither shall ye touch it, lest ye die. Well, they couldn't even eat it. They couldn't even touch it. Now, you might be sitting here, we're not going to cover this today, but why would God put a tree like that in the middle of the garden and tell them, hey, don't touch it? You've all had little children. Funny story, my oldest son, when he was about maybe 2, almost 2, something like that. I had just mopped the kitchen floor. Yes, I did, with that mop and glow junk that, it's sticky for a while and then it gets clear. Those who not, you know what I'm talking about. So you're not supposed to walk on it, right? So he wanted to go in the kitchen. It's like, because that was off limits. And I sat there and watched him, and he's got his toes hanging just over the edge, right? And then you could see his face. It's like, I got this idea. So he runs off to his room and he grabs his truck and he runs back in and throws it in the kitchen. And then you can see, I got to go get my truck. So in he went with his truck. I had to curtail my laughing. I was about to die even though I got onto him. How we come up with the excuses for breaking laws. He was going to walk in there and he'd come up with a good logical reason to do it to get his truck. Do we do that? Does God draw a boundary for us and we throw our proverbial truck over into the other side? And then we go, oh, hey, look, he didn't say anything about me not picking up my truck. Right? I can go do that. I can break this law. Right? So we're all guilty of it. Oh boy, here we go. I don't know why this thing doesn't recognize me. It says, for God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing good and evil. So what's the promise here? What did the serpent just say? Well, you know why God's not letting you have that tree? Because you're going to be a god if you eat from it. That's why he told you not to eat that. He's holding out on you. Right? And you're going to know the knowledge between good and evil. Now, up to this time, what kind of knowledge did they have? Just good. Right. That's all they had. They didn't have any knowledge of evil because they hadn't really experienced it. What is the serpent offering? Anything good? No. He's just offering the evil part, right? So now look what happens here. And the woman saw the tree was good for food. Oh, I have an excuse. I threw my truck in the kitchen. That's what she's doing, isn't it? That it was pleasant to the eye, and the tree is desired to make one wise. She took of the fruit thereof and did eat. So she wanted to be wise. She had a physical need to want to be wise. And so I know I'm using this truck example, sorry, but it's really what she did. It's like, hey, wow, he is holding out on me. I'm going to go over there, I'm going to eat that fruit, and I'm going to be like God. And then what happens? She gives it to her husband. He's standing there with her. Okay, now, this is for another lesson, but who gets the blame for her eating it? Adam. Why was it his responsibility? Because he was the one God gave the command to. Eve wasn't present when he gave her that command. Right? He knew. He should have stepped in and said, no, honey, not that. Right? He didn't do it. What was worse was he fell prey to her and ate it too. And now they know they were naked, right? So there was our first big deception. And we find out that, guess what? So here in Revelation 12:9, which we'll cover this in the next bout of deception in part 2, it says, the great dragon was thrown down in the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. That's who she was facing, the deceiver of the whole world. Now, would you and I have done differently? Oh, we think we would, right? But would we have? Because we're looking at it now because we have better knowledge. But if you were standing there, would you have eaten from the tree? Probably, right? I want to think I wouldn't, but I probably would have, right? That's very disappointing. But it's the thing that we have to understand is we stand no chance up against the deceiver of the world without Christ. This is impossible. We don't have a prayer because we're just not that powerful, right? So what was Eve's primary failing? She had a desire to be wise. When we're deceived, just like my friend, greed got him, Bernie Madoff's friends, greed got them, there's something that's causing you to want to fill that gap, right? So in this case, she wanted to be wise. She thought God was holding out on her. She could become a god. So she was deceived and she broke one of God's primary, only rule actually, to take of that tree, just to be wise. So she was deceived, right? All right. The next one. This is probably one that I've read and read and read. You just scratch your head. All right. Samson and Delilah. We know the story. Now, a little bit about Samson. He loved women. In chapter 16, where we're going to go, the chapter opens up, he goes in and finds him a prostitute. Okay? So that was his big failing. And if you remember reading that story of him, he was doing all kinds of things for God because he gave him great strength. But he just loved women. He was always going after the wrong ones. And so it just created all kinds of problems for him, right? Let's see here. Let me get over to the right chapter here. And we'll pick this up. All right, so starting at verse 3. Verse 4. And it came to pass afterward that he loved a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. And the lords of the Philistines came unto her, and said unto her, Entice him, and see wherein his great strength lieth. So he fell in love with this woman. Now, what is it what's driving him? Right? So I'll just hop on ahead here. What's driving him is physical attraction and sex. It's a very powerful force. And he fell in love with, she's probably very pretty, very beautiful. And so guys typically, not all of them, they let their guard down around a pretty nice girl. They do. That's just part of what they do. They'll do it. And that's what he did. So he let his guard down. And what does she do? They come to her and say, hey, what can you do to find out the source of his strength? So she sets about trying to do it. Now, she does this 3 times. The first 2 times, he gives her the wrong answer, and each time the Philistines run in to get him, and of course he breaks the bounds or whatever he's supposed to do, and he throws them all out. Now, here's the question. What's going on in Samson's head that he could see this? I mean, if your wife kept saying, here, drink this stuff, and you got sick and it had Drano in it, and you had, the next time it was like turpentine or something, and the third meal she was going to serve to you, you'd be a little bit worried about it. I mean, seriously. You step back and you look at this and you go, why was he not open to this? He didn't see this. It was right there. She was deceiving him constantly, and he could see this. But he was so enamored by her that he just blocked it all out, right? Have you ever been like that, where you just so lasered in on what you want that you don't, and you ignore all the false signs that are coming at you? This is why we go back to that verse in Proverbs, right? If we just fool's folly, we rush in, we do something like that without stepping back and asking for God to help, because we may not see it, right? We may not see it. So this is just a marvel to me that he did this. But anyway, this goes on a lot. So, all right. Probably the one that I wrestled with the most is Jacob. And I've listed a whole bunch of stuff. You probably can't read him up there. It's pretty small. But Jacob was an interesting character, right? When he was born, Esau came out and he was hanging on to Esau's leg. So he was born second. So what that meant in those days, Esau got the birthright. So he's the one that gets the inheritance. He gets the blessing from his father, the whole thing. And Jacob, and Esau was what you call, kind of a John Wayne character. He liked to run out and be a brawler and hunt and do all the things that you think these like manly men do, right? Not Jacob. Jacob was not that way. He was more of a mama's boy, and he was a deceiver. Right? So the first time is when Esau comes in for the field and he's hungry, and what does Jacob do? He cooks a meal. He must have been a good cook. And he first makes Esau give up his birthright for this bowl of porridge. Now, we sit here and go, oh my gosh, would you give up your birthright for a bowl of soup? We think that's stupid. However, how many people are going through life giving up their future afterlife for essentially a bowl of soup? It might be a big bank account, might be an affair on the side, it might be something else that you've done, but you're trading your soul for a bowl of soup. That's really what it comes down to. How many people do that today, right? Are you willing to go after that truck and trade your soul for it? I don't think so. If you know the cost. But if you don't know the cost, you might do it. He does it again. So he pretends to be Esau when his dad's going to bless him. His dad's about to pass on. And so him and his mother actually put some hair on the back of his hand. So it feels like Esau because he was a hairy guy. And his dad falls for it and blesses Jacob instead of Esau. Again, that's deceptive, isn't it? He didn't get it outright. So, and then he goes on and he manipulates Laban here with his flocks, and he actually leaves Laban, which is, we'll get into that in a second. That's where he got his two wives, his father-in-law, and he didn't tell him where he was going. And then he was scared of Esau, and he told Esau he was going to go to one town, and he goes to another one. So he was just constantly being deceptive and deceiving. Now, what's interesting is God actually let him be deceived. So we'll flip it over. So Laban tricks him too. So he works 7 years. So he comes to him and he goes, hey, you got this beautiful daughter, Rachel. And he says, great, I'll give her to you, but you're going to work for me for 7 years. So he does that. And then guess who has to be in on this? The older sister too, right? Because on marriage night, he goes into her and guess what? It's Leah. It's not Rachel. So then he's like, hey, you tricked me. And he goes, great, if you still want Rachel, it's another 7 years. So he has to work 7 more years to be able to marry her. And then he works, he goes on here with continually changing his wages all the time. But here's the big one that happened to him, and probably the one that impacted him the most. His son Joseph, he thought was dead and killed, right? And he had to live with that for a long time, a very long time. So he was grief-stricken over it, but he was deceived by his own sons. So it's interesting that you see he was deceiving, but God was allowing him to be deceived. And we get this picture of him wrestling. Remember he was wrestling with this angel that was God, and he ends up with a leg that was kind of maimed in the whole process. And so here's a really interesting thing about this. Jacob's name meaning is follow or to be behind, or to be behind. That was the name of Jacob. Well, he was behind Esau, that's why. But I think that name had a bigger meaning. Jacob struggled and fought God because he did not want to be behind God. He was trying to always get ahead of God. And he had to wrestle with God to learn his place. Do you see that? That was his big wrestling match through life. His name even said that, to be behind, and he wouldn't follow God. So he was always wrestling and wrestling and wrestling until he finally did, right? But that was the big thing. He was deceiving just like the great deceiver does. And he was allowed to be deceived by God. But ultimately it was to show him his position. He truly needed to be behind God and to follow God. Had he done that, his life would have been probably, better. Now, as it turns out at the end, he does get to see his son Joseph, right? And that whole family gets saved because of the famines and everything that happened to him because of what went on. All right, so I'm going to close. Set your eyes on Jesus. The number one thing is, there's a lot of other examples in here too. I was thinking about David and Bathsheba, and I could just go on. The many, many, many times throughout the Bible we've seen deception. But it always comes back to this. If we don't follow God's word, we are being open to being deceived. And it comes from those things that are physical to us. We either have greed or lust of flesh or pride of life. And you go back to ego drives a lot of things, right? A firefighter I was talking about early on, he did all this to build his ego. He had wanted to be a policeman on the LAPD, and he failed the psychology exam. Well, there was a clue. He was an arsonist, that's why. But because he felt like that, and a lot of the stores he burned is because he couldn't become a firefighter for a while, and he worked in those stores, and he hated it. So that's what's driving him. But he wanted to be a hero so he could go start fires and then come back and put them out, or be the one that solved the crime, right? Or at least pointed out that. And he wrote manuals, and that way he got to be the hero. So his ego was the thing that was driving him. I don't know what that is for us. Each of us have weaknesses, right? We all do. And that's why Christianity is a team sport. We pull together as a church, and we have a leader through Christ that can help us. Now, am I going to guarantee you're never going to get deceived? No. There's too many rotten people out there. They go to great lengths. I mean, absolutely great lengths to deceive others, right? But we can be cautious. You can stop and think before you get into something. If it sounds too good to be true, I've lived long enough, it probably is. Now, if I missed a couple of things because of that, yeah, but that's all right. I would rather do that than go the other way, because I've made my share of mistakes by rushing in too quickly. And that's the whole thing. So set your eyes on Jesus. When you're encountering something and you're not sure, I give my wife credit. She's got like a sixth sense. Maybe a lot of you ladies are like this. She'll tell me, she said, I'm not comfortable with this. Something's wrong. It's like, well, what is it? I don't know. It's like, okay. So I listen now because she's usually picked up on something that I don't see, right? And we joke about it, but God works through her to get to me sometimes, right? Any men in here have that? Well, he does, and it's happened multiple times. And she's been dead right about a lot of stuff too because of that. So I give him credit for that. Ephesians, let me get there. Ephesians 5:6. Let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. You've heard the term itching ears. People love to hear things, right? They love to have those words spoke to them that make them feel good, or tell them everything's going to be great if you just only do this or you only do that. You need to check in with God. There's a story which I'll touch on in our next session, but Nehemiah, I love that whole book. Nehemiah is standing in front of the king, and he's got an option. King actually asked him what's wrong. Now, in the position he was in, if he said the wrong thing, the king could just have his head taken off. So it's a very scary thing. But before he answered the king, he prayed to God first. And it doesn't mean you have to go in the closet and say, well, wait a minute, I'm going to run in the closet. He didn't do that. He just talked to God while he was right there in the conversation, right? That's what he did before he told the king. And we know the rest of this all worked out because of that. But that's the thing. The next thing is, and I'll read this, something that Jesus warned us of. 24. Sorry. All right. Starting in verse 4, it says, Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And ye shall hear of wars and rumors of wars, and see that ye be not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For the nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in divers places. All these things are the beginnings of sorrow. And he goes on to tell him, hey, look, you're going to be delivered up to be killed. There's all this other stuff's going to happen. He said, do not be deceived. Don't be deceived. There are people today preaching all kinds of stuff. There's a guy, I'll just name him, Joel Osteen. If I offend you in any way, sorry. But I did listen to the guy for like 6 months. So I wanted to see for myself. And he preaches this like prosperity gospel, and it's all fluffed up, and right? There's no mention of sin. There's no mention of falling away. It's all about you and your dreams. It's not about God. And it's a false gospel, right? There are lots of people doing this, and there are a lot of people following that. That's a deception. Don't be deceived by it. There are going to be all kinds of people telling you that, oh, you're just okay. You don't have to do anything, right? You know, and there were even people in Paul's day teaching, hey, look, there's grace. There's so much grace from Jesus. I know this sounds ridiculous. Go sin a bunch because you get more grace that way. That sounds, they were actually doing that. This is insane. But he's saying, don't do that. Don't be deceived. There's all this stuff going to happen around you that looks bad. Don't worry, I got it. That's what he's saying. I've got it. You just stay focused on me, right? And that's hard to do. I'll close with this verse here. It says, 2 Thessalonians 2, 3 and 4 says, Let no one deceive you in any way, for that day will not come unless the rebellion comes first, and the man of lawlessness is revealed, the son of destruction, who opposes and exalts himself against every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God. Now, what is the temple of God? Us. So when he says they're going to take the seat as God in the temple of God, what is that? Is that not the same thing that Eve just did? She ate that fruit and it said, what? You can be a God. And what was Christ telling us here? When this happens, people are going to be taken up in the temple of God, proclaiming to be God. That's the very same deception that we started with. That's how it's going to end. I think that's kind of an interesting tie-out. People think they're going to be gods, and they'll take that up as God, and I can proclaim whatever I want, and I can do whatever I want. We're seeing that today, aren't we? So the great deceptions, nothing's changed. The very first lie to Eve is how the world's going to end, with that lie right back again. You are a God. And people are buying into it again. Don't be deceived. Again, keep your eyes on Christ. If you come to the point in your life where you either haven't accepted Christ, if you've fallen away, or you've got some prayers and restore yourself, now's the time to come forward as we stand and sing.